Some truths lie not in daylight, but beneath locked doors and whispered conspiracies. This tale begins in a Bloomsbury boarding house, where a vanished lodger, a restless cat, and a hidden casket of names drew Holmes into a web darker than any mere theft. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us step quietly into the corridors where justice waited, patient as the night, until the guilty themselves turned the key. London was wrapped in one of those dense, clinging fogs that transform even the most familiar thoroughfares into ghostly corridors of shadow and half-light. The lamps along Baker Street shone dimly through the vapour, their glow broken into hazy aureoles, while the rattle of a distant hansom seemed to come from no earthly direction, but from the very bowels of the mist itself. Within our snug rooms at 221B, the crackle of the fire and the ticking of the clock were the only sounds to challenge the heavy stillness without. Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair, his keen eyes half closed, a thin wreath of smoke curling from his pipe, as though he were some Eastern sage immersed in meditation. I had been endeavouring, with less concentration, to occupy myself with the evening paper, though the dim light and my own wandering thoughts rendered the print blurred and uncertain. There was about the evening that indefinable weight which precedes the intrusion of the unusual. More than once I glanced at my companion, wondering if his extraordinary faculties had already divined some approaching disturbance. His stillness was so profound that when at last it was broken, it seemed almost violent in contrast. For through the fog and over the hiss of the fire, there came a sound so faint that I doubted my own senses at first. A curious scratching, as of claws or nails, persistent and measured, at our very door. I looked to Holmes. His eyes were already open, the languor vanished, and a flicker of curiosity had replaced it. "Well, Watson," he murmured, laying aside his pipe, "we shall have our interruptions sooner than expected." The noise came again, this time more distinct, as though some creature, intent upon entrance, applied itself with patient determination to the panel of our door. It was not, and now stood at my shoulder, his face alive with interest. "You will note, Watson," he said softly, "the peculiar rhythm. Not the blind fumbling of chance, but an effort directed with singular purpose. Whatever lies beyond, it comes not by accident." With that enigmatic comment, he motioned for me to open the door wide. What greeted us was no spectre of man, but a creature of fur and bone, a large black cat, its coat plastered with rain and its eyes gleaming like twin coals against the dimness of the landing. It stood as though it had been awaiting the widening of the door, then advanced a pace, tail erect, and uttered a long, low cry, which was neither wholly plaintive nor wholly fierce, but possessed some quality of both that set my nerves tingling. The poor beast was drenched to the skin, its paws leaving small dark prints upon our carpet as it moved with deliberate steps into the room. Holmes bent instantly, his long fingers stroking the matted fur with an attentiveness that might have startled those who supposed him indifferent to the softer sympathies of life. "A singular visitor, Watson," he observed, peering into the creature's eyes, as though seeking therein the record of its adventures, and not alone, if I mistake not. Even as he spoke, the sound of hurried footsteps rose faintly from the stair below, accompanied by the rustle of skirts and the quick, uneven breathing of one who has ascended with haste. The cat, as though in anticipation, turned its gaze sharply toward the door once more and uttered another cry, this time more urgent. Holmes straightened, the ghost of a smile upon his lips. "Our second caller, I perceive. The cat is but the herald." The door was pushed wider, and there entered a lady of middle years, her figure cloaked against the storm, her features pale and drawn with agitation. Her eyes, wide with anxiety, fastened instantly upon the animal, which ran to her with a strange mixture of attachment and insistence. "Mrs. Lydia Carstone," she announced, breathlessly, as if to forestall our inquiry. "Gentlemen, I crave your pardon for intruding at such an hour, but necessity drives me." She pressed one hand to her bosom, steadying her breath, while the other clutched at the sleeve of her dripping cloak. Holmes had already offered her a chair and regarded her with that grave courtesy which he could assume at will. "Pray compose yourself, madam. You are among friends. This creature is yours." "Yes, sir, mine, though more properly belonging to another. It was my lodger's, Mr. Ellery's. Since his disappearance, the poor beast has shown the strangest conduct, and I feared I could endure it no longer without counsel." "Disappearance?" I echoed, for her words bore the chill of darker implication. She nodded quickly. "Gone these many weeks, sir, without word or payment. Yet nightly the cat scratches at his door, as if to summon him forth. It will not rest, it will not leave, and I cannot but think it knows more than it may tell." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers, his eyes half closed yet keenly alive. "A trivial circumstance in the world's eyes," he murmured, "and yet it has drawn you through the fog to Baker Street. You did well to come, Mrs. Carstone. Animals, in their unreasoning fidelity, sometimes point the way more truly than man's boasted reason." There was in the lady's manner that mingled shame and urgency which I have so often observed in those who turn to my friend for counsel in matters beyond their own compass. She clasped her hands together as she spoke, her voice trembling between entreaty and fear. "Mr. Ellery, the lodger, has been absent for more than a month," she explained. "He gave no notice, left no forwarding address, and yet the chamber he rented remains locked as though he might return at any moment. I have hesitated to disturb it, for I feared his wrath should he reappear. But it is not the locked room that troubles me so much as the conduct of this creature." She bent to stroke the cat, which turned away from her touch and sat upright, its eyes fixed as though upon some unseen point in the distance. "Night after night," she continued, "the cat scratches at his door. It does so with such persistence that the other tenor light that betokened the stirrings of his intellect. His voice, low yet commanding, cut into the silence with sharp precision. "You will tell me, madam, what sort of man was this Mr. Ellery, his profession, his habits, his acquaintances?" Mrs. Carstone hesitated, as if reluctant to speak ill, but under Holmes's penetrating gaze she faltered out the truth. "He was a man of some education, sir, though idle. He spoke often of investments, and there were whispers of debt. He received few visitors, yet once or twice men of foreign accent called upon him. His manner was secretive, and more than once I noted him slipping into the house at strange hours." Holmes nodded gravely. "And his departure, was it sudden?" "Yes, sir. One morning he was simply gone. He left behind certain articles of clothing, and I fancied I could still smell tobacco in the air of his room. But the key he took." Holmes's fingers ceased their drumming. "Most suggestive," he murmured. "A man does not leave garments yet carries a key, unless he intends return. And the animal, has it always attached itself to him?" "Ever since he brought it, sir. Yet since his absence it will scarcely leave the threshold of his door." Holmes rose abruptly and paced the room, his long strides betraying excitement. "A most singular case, Watson. Here we have not only the conduct of man, but the instincts of beast converging upon the same point. Depend upon it, there is more behind that locked door than our landlady dares to surmise." Holmes turned his gaze once more upon the cat, which had settled by the hearth, yet lifted its head at intervals to cast furtive glances toward the outer passage. It seemed, by some uncanny instinct, to mark a boundary between the safe warmth of our rooms and the mystery that lay beyond. With rare tenderness, Holmes crouched to study the creature. He observed the angle of its ears, the restless sweep of its tail, and the sharp insistence of its gaze whenever the absent lodger's name was mentioned. "Note it well, Watson," said he. "The dumb creatures perceive what we, in our conceit, too often disregard. This animal is not restless without cause. There is something behind that door which its senses apprehend, though ours do not. The words, uttered so quietly, fell with weight upon my mind, and I confess that the hairs upon my neck stirred involuntarily at the thought. At length Mrs. Carstone rose, murmuring her gratitude, though still pale with apprehension. Holmes conducted her with courtly gravity to the door, and when she was gone he resumed his seat, gazing into the fire. The flickering glow played upon his features, accentuating the hawk-like profile and the furrow of thought between his brows. "It is curious, Watson," he said at last, "how often beasts recognize what men deny. There is wisdom in their fidelity." The cat had remained, crouched upon our rug, as if it, too, were a client awaiting judgment. Holmes regarded it for a long moment, then leaned forward, his voice edged with meaning. "Animals, my dear Watson," said he, "often notice what men are pleased to ignore." At that instant the fire hissed, the wind moaned beyond the windows, and the cat lifted its head with a low cry, as though in confirmation. The next morning found us threading our way through the pale haze that hung above the quiet streets of Bloomsbury. It was one of those mornings when London, stripped of its tumult, wears a subdued and watchful aspect, as though the very houses were listening for news from within their walls. The boarding house to which Mrs. Carstone directed us stood in a row of respectable dwellings, its brickwork dulled by years of smoke, its windows neither well kept nor wholly neglected, but bearing that air of genteel decay which so often conceals curious dramas behind closed curtains. I could not help but contrast its exterior quietude with the tale she had poured into our ears the night before. Business, though when pressed for particulars she could supply neither the name of the city nor the nature of his occupation. "Gone to the continent, sir, that is all I know," she repeated, her voice rising to a nervous pitch. "He was a quiet gentleman, punctual with his rent, though perhaps too fond of solitude. He carried a trunk away with him, but he left. He left another, which he said I was not to disturb." Holmes fixed her with that piercing gaze of his, which seemed to strip away evasions as the sun burns through mist. "And you obeyed him?" Her eyes dropped. "I have no wish to meddle with my tenant's affairs, Mr. Holmes. Besides, the cat scratching has unsettled the household enough. Some say it is an ill omen, others that the animal grieves for its master. I tell them he will return, though heaven knows when." She twisted her hands anew, and her glance shifted uneasily toward the staircase, as though she feared to linger upon the subject. I was struck by her eagerness to end the conversation, for she seemed less intent upon giving information than upon concealing it. Holmes's lips twitched into the faintest smile, and I knew that her very reluctance had furnished him with what he sought. As we ascended the stairs, the sound of a hacking cough broke the hush of the corridor. At the landing we came upon a tall, gaunt man in a worn military greatcoat, his shoulders stooped and his face furrowed by both age and long service. He introduced himself as Colonel Barrington, late of the Bengal Lancers, though his words were punctuated by spasms of coughing that shook his frame. His courtesy was genuine, yet his eyes darted uneasily from Holmes to myself, as though measuring how much we might divine. "A strange business about that fellow Ellery," he muttered, gripping the banister with bony fingers. "But mark me, gentlemen, I trouble myself with no man's affairs. I keep my own counsel." Holmes inclined his head politely, but I observed how he lingered on the Colonel's trembling hand and the anxious glance that followed us as we passed. "The cough is real enough," Holmes whispered when we were beyond earshot, "but the nervousness. Ah, Watson, that is a symptom of a different malady. This house breathes unease, and each tenant inhales it. The next lodger we encountered was of a very different aspect. A young man in paint-flecked garments, his hair dishevelled, and his fingers blotched with crimson and blue. He was seated upon the stair, with a sketchbook upon his knees, though, at our approach, he shut it hastily, as though fearful we might glimpse some secret therein. Holmes engaged him with genial indifference. "You find the light here favourable, perhaps?" The artist started and coloured. "Favourable enough, sir, though the atmosphere is not what one could wish. Too many disturbances of late." He shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking toward the upper floor. "Disturbances?" I asked. "Oh, nothing. Nothing of consequence," he replied quickly. "Merely the scratching of that confounded cat. It unnerves a fellow's work when he must listen to it for hours. As to Mr. Ellery, well, I cannot say. We artists are dreamers, not detectives." He gave a short laugh, which rang hollow, and then excused himself, clutching his sketchbook tightly to his chest as he retreated. Holmes's glance followed him with quiet intensity. "Paint upon the fingers, Watson, yet none upon the cuffs," he remarked softly, a sign that his labours lie less upon canvas than in deception. "And note his haste to remove himself from question. There is more colour upon his conscience than upon his brush." The shadow of mystery deepened with every step we took within that house, and I began to understand why Holmes's eyes shone with that peculiar brilliance which heralded the unfolding of some intricate enigma. As we turned the corner of the landing, a shadow fell across our path. A tall, sallow-faced youth emerged from one of the upper chambers, his dark hair disordered, his attire plain to the point of austerity. His steps were light, yet deliberate, and he carried in his hand a small volume bound in foreign lettering. He inclined his head, but either a scholar or a spy. We shall see which. The whisper, spoken with cool deliberation, left me with a shiver of unease, for in that moment the boarding-house seemed less a place of lodging and more a stage upon which each tenant played some hidden part. It was at the uppermost passage that we encountered once again the strange sentinel of this mystery, the black cat. There it crouched before the locked chamber of Mr. Ellery, its sleek body pressed close to the door, its claws raking with slow persistence at the wood, as though each stroke were a syllable in some unspoken appeal. The sound echoed along the corridor, unnerving in its constancy, and brought forth muttered complaints from behind closed doors. Mrs. Carstone herself appeared, her face drawn with worry. "There, you see, gentlemen? It begins every evening and will not cease till dawn. I have tried coaxing it away, but it always returns, as if chained to the very threshold." Holmes bent swiftly, his long fingers brushing over the scratches upon the panel. "Fresh, Watson. Not the work of idle days past, but renewed nightly. Observe how the wood is worn smooth where the creature insists upon a single point. This animal does not scratch by chance, but by memory." I could not shake the eerie impression that the cat was less beast than messenger, stationed here by some strange fidelity to its absent master. Its green eyes flashed as it turned toward us, yowling with uncanny emphasis, before resuming its silent watch. Holmes straightened slowly, and in the subdued light of the landing, his profile seemed hawk-like, severe, and charged with thought. "There is something," he said softly, "within this room that draws even the instinct of a brute." Holmes's scrutiny did not rest with the door alone. With sudden decision, he dropped to one knee, his gaze travelling over the mat that lay before it. I watched as he touched the fibres lightly, then passed his fingers over the wooden floor beyond. "You perceive nothing, Watson?" he asked, without looking up. "Nothing save a little dust." "Ah, but dust, my dear fellow, is one of the most eloquent of witnesses. Look closely. Here it lies undisturbed, but there," he indicated with his long forefinger, "it is faintly scuffed. Not the passage of many feet, but of one who has moved stealthily, seeking to leave no trace. The pattern is recent, See how the particles still cling. I bent lower and detected at last the difference, subtle but undeniable. Holmes, with the air of a priest conducting some solemn rite, produced his magnifying lens and studied the mat's corner. A smile, thin and cold, touched his lips. "Tobacco ash," he declared, yet Mrs. Carstone assured us that Mr. Ellery was the only smoker in her house. Either he has returned, or another has trespassed in his stead. The conclusion struck me with force. That silent door, the cat's strange insistence, the uneasy tenants, all seemed suddenly bound by invisible threads to a presence that refused to vanish entirely. Holmes rose, dusting his knees, his eyes alight with certainty. "We tread close, Watson. Very close." The passage was dim, the fog outside pressing faintly against the panes, and the hush of the house seemed to deepen as Holmes leaned near to me. His voice, though scarcely above a whisper, carried the weight of irrevocable decision. "Ellery's absence is but a story," said he. "These traces, the cat's devotion, the evasions of the landlady, all point to one conclusion. Someone has entered that chamber, and recently. Whether it is Ellery himself or another masquerading in his shadow, I cannot yet say. But rest assured, Watson, the door conceals not emptiness, but a secret." I felt the chill of his words as one might feel the draught from an open crypt. Even as he spoke, the cat gave a low growl, as if to echo his conviction. Holmes placed a hand lightly upon the knob, testing it with the delicacy of a surgeon's touch, before withdrawing with a slight shake of his head. "Patience," he murmured. "The locked door yields not to force but to time, and time, as ever, is our ally." With that, he turned abruptly down the corridor, his stride purposeful, while I followed with a mind crowded by questions. Fitting that I should allow strangers within. Mr. Ellery may yet return, and I would not wish to face his anger should he find his privacy violated. Holmes inclined his head slightly, but I marked the flicker of impatience in his eyes. "Your sense of propriety does you credit," he said evenly. "And yet you will forgive me if I remark that silence and locked doors often conceal that which would fain avoid the light." The woman trembled and muttered something about her duties, excusing herself with unseemly haste. I caught the faintest smile upon Holmes's lips as he turned to me. "You observe, Watson," said he, "the eagerness with which she flees the subject. A denial given in such a manner is but a confession of another sort." Holmes stood a moment in silence after the landlady's retreat, his long fingers clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon the darkened stair that led to the upper floor. I could read the signs well enough. The gleam in his eyes, the faint compression of the lips, the forward thrust of the chin. These were tokens I had come to know, and each bespoke an unshakable determination. He spoke at last, his tone calm, almost conversational. "Since we are denied the direct path, Watson, we must employ the indirect. The truth lies behind that door, and the truth will not be denied us. Tonight, when the house sleeps, we shall acquaint ourselves with Mr. Ellery's chamber." The quiet assurance with which he uttered these words left me in no doubt that his decision was final. For my own part, I confess to a thrill of anticipation, mingled with unease, at the prospect of a nocturnal intrusion. The memory of the cat's persistent vigil, and of the nervous faces of the tenants, weighed upon me like a silent admonition. Yet Holmes's iron will was contagious, and I found myself already calculating in my mind the hour at which the house would be most deeply sunk in slumber. Holmes, perceiving my thoughts, smiled faintly. "You need not fear, Watson. We shall move as softly as the night itself." When at last the house was steeped in silence, and the lamps along the street outside had burned to mere points of misty flame, Holmes touched my arm and rose. Together we stole into the corridor, our steps muffled upon the carpet, though the ancient boards beneath groaned faintly in protest. The hush of the place was so profound that even the faint creak of a stair seemed to echo like a shot. The air was heavy with that peculiar stillness which belongs to sleeping houses. a stillness in which the imagination peoples every shadow with lurking shapes. As we passed the colonel's door, a spasm of coughing broke the silence, followed by a long, wheezing sigh. It was as though the house itself reminded us that its tenants dreamed uneasy dreams. At the end of the corridor we came to the door of Ellery's chamber. Holmes knelt swiftly, his delicate instruments glinting faintly in the light of the shaded lantern he carried. The soft rasp of steel upon steel was the only sound, save for my own heart, beating somewhat faster than I cared to admit. "Not the first lock this key has turned," Holmes murmured, as the latch yielded with scarce a protest. "There is a certain liberality in landlords, but none would have chosen such a crude fastening unless he desired that it be easily overcome." With that, he pressed gently upon the door. It swung open without a sound, and we passed into the darkness beyond. The beam of Holmes's lantern swept slowly across the interior, revealing a chamber strangely barren, as though stripped of all that gave it character. The bed stood bare, its counterpane folded with mechanical precision. The window was closed fast, its curtains drawn. Upon the desk lay an ink-stained blotter, the nib of a pen crusted with the residue of hurried scrawls. Beside it a candle, burned to half its height, guttered feebly when Holmes lit it from his match. But what drew our eyes most was a single glove, lying carelessly upon the floor as though dropped in haste. It was of fine kid, but stained faintly, the mark of a hand that had pressed it too close to ink or soil.
Threshold, Watson. The threshold of revelation. Holmes had already cast his keen glance about the barren chamber, but now, with that feline suppleness of movement peculiar to him, he dropped to his knees and pressed his magnifying lens close to the carpet. I followed his gaze and discerned faint depressions in the fibres, scarcely visible to my untutored eye. "Here, Watson," he murmured, indicating the marks with a forefinger. "Do you observe the symmetry? 2 impressions, side by side, deeper at the fore, lighter behind. A man has knelt here." He leaned forward and remained so for some minutes. The weight and persistence have crushed the nap of the fabric. I bent closer, straining to detect what his trained senses had already divined. Indeed, there was a subtle flattening, a ghostly outline of knees impressed into the carpet, though no ordinary eye might have marked it without guidance. "Not long ago," Holmes continued softly. "Note how the fibres still retain their suppleness. Were it of an earlier date, they would have recovered their spring." He raised his head, his eyes flashing in the dim glow of the lantern. "Someone, Watson, has prayed to a treasure hidden beneath these boards. Not to heaven, but to secrecy." The suggestion struck me with a chill, for there was in those faint indentations the silent testimony of a man bending, not in reverence, but in concealment. At that moment, a low cry broke the hush, startling me so that I rose to my feet with an involuntary exclamation. The black cat, that uncanny sentinel of our mystery, had slipped silently into the chamber. Its eyes glowed in the lantern light, and with a strange determination, it advanced toward the very spot Holmes had examined. With a yowl that was half appeal, half menace, it stretched forth a paw and began to rake furiously at the floorboards near the threshold. The sound was harsh in the stillness, claws striking wood with a persistence that made the hairs rise on my neck. Holmes watched intently, his expression curiously softened. "Remarkable fidelity," he murmured. "The brute has served as guardian and witness both. It knows, Watson. It knows where the secret lies." The animal's cries grew louder, echoing along the corridor, until I feared they would rouse the entire household. I moved as if to drive it away, but Holmes arrested my arm. "No, let it speak in its own tongue. It indicates more surely than words where we must direct our search." The cat's gaze fixed upon Holmes as though in recognition, and then once more it scratched insistently at the board. My companion bent, his thin fingers tracing the grain of the wood, his head inclined as if listening to a confidant. Holmes produced from his pocket the small steel probe he was wont to carry. With deft precision, he tapped along the boards until a note, hollow and resonant, answered the stroke. He smiled with grim satisfaction, his ear bent close to the floor. "There lies our quarry, Watson," he whispered. "Mark how the sound alters here. Solid, solid, and then, hollow. Beneath is some cavity, and within that cavity, if I mistake not, something metallic. You hear the faint reverberation, like the ring of iron upon stone." I strained my senses, and indeed a difference was perceptible, subtle yet distinct, as if a hidden chamber echoed the vibration. Holmes rapped again, the metallic timbre unmistakable. "Something lies here," he repeated with conviction. "A box, perhaps, or a casket. Concealment is its language, guilt its companion. Ellery's disappearance, the cat's devotion, the landlady's evasion, all centre upon this spot." He slipped the probe into the seam, testing the resistance. The board quivered slightly beneath the pressure, as though upon the air. "We are not alone, Watson. Someone keeps vigil with us tonight." Holmes's hand shot out and pressed firmly upon my sleeve. With a silent gesture, he beckoned me to withdraw into a dark recess of the corridor, where the angle of the wall and the heavy draperies of a nearby window concealed us from view. I obeyed at once, my pulse quickening, for at that instant the unmistakable rasp of a key turning in a lock reached our ears. It was Ellery's door. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dimness, his finger raised in a command of silence. The faint metallic click was followed by the slow, cautious movement of the latch. A moment later the panel opened an inch, then another, until the silhouette of a figure emerged against the faint glow of a shaded lantern. There was something stealthy, almost feline, in the intruder's movements, each step placed with deliberate caution, each pause prolonged as though he listened for the least betrayal of sound. I could feel Holmes tense beside me, every nerve alert, though his control was absolute. "Patience, Watson," he breathed, scarcely more than a whisper. To strike now would be folly. Let him show his purpose. The door closed behind the figure with the softest of thuds, leaving the corridor once more in gloom. Yet within, I could hear the boards faintly creak beneath the weight of deliberate feet, as the intruder moved deeper into the chamber. Through the narrow aperture of the door, left imperfectly shut, I glimpsed the scene within. A cloaked figure, tall and lean, moved across the room with a lantern held low in his hand. The wavering light cast grotesque shadows upon the walls, so that the bare chamber seemed peopled with distorted phantoms that leered and beckoned. The intruder paused often, tilting his head like some nocturnal bird, as though fearful of listeners beyond the panels. Then, with a swift motion, he drew the cloak tighter about his frame and advanced toward the centre of the room. Holmes leaned toward me, his lips brushing my ear. "Mark the manner of his step, Watson. Practised caution, the gait of one accustomed to peril. This is no common burglar. He knows both what he seeks and the risk of seeking it." The figure set down the lantern upon the desk, its light falling across the ink-stained blotter and the half-burned candle we had observed before. Then he knelt suddenly, the cloak falling about him like wings, and extended a hand toward the very section of floor which had drawn both Holmes's scrutiny and the cat's restless attention. I confess that in that moment my impulse was to rush forward, to seize the fellow and unmask him, for my heart throbbed with indignation at such secret tampering. Yet Holmes's iron grip restrained me, his eyes fixed in rapt attention upon the unfolding drama. The silence was broken by the faint creak of timber, followed by the slow, deliberate scraping of metal upon wood. The sound set my teeth on edge, for it was as though the house itself protested against the violation of its hidden recesses. The intruder's movements were methodical. With careful leverage, he raised the very board which the cat had marked with its nightly vigil. Holmes's eyes glowed with triumph. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "our instincts, and those of the beast, were true. There lies the secret of Ellery's disappearance." Within the gloom, the figure bent lower, his lantern now casting its light directly into the cavity. I could discern the outline of a small object being drawn forth, the faint gleam of polished surface reflecting the lantern's glow. The man handled it with reverence, as though fearful of damaging its contents. The scrape of the board being replaced followed, though less carefully than before, as if haste now outweighed caution. The intruder straightened, the outline of his shoulders tense with effort, and clutched the object close beneath his cloak. At that instant, Holmes's breath touched my ear once more. "The spider approaches his prize, Watson, but the web is not yet closed." It was then that a sound reached us, faint, muffled, yet unmistakable. The rattle of metal striking metal, a subdued clink as of coins or jewels shifting within a casket. The noise, slight as it was, seemed thunderous in the silence, and I felt a surge of impatience course that followed was more dreadful than any noise. We stood motionless in the corridor, scarcely daring to breathe, while within the blackness the faintest shuffle of retreating steps could be heard. The man had secured his prize and was making for the door. Holmes's eyes glimmered in the faint spill of light from the stairwell, and I saw the restrained fire in them. "Steady, Watson," he breathed. "The spider waits, and we shall not yet disturb the web." I could scarcely endure the suspense. My hand had already moved toward the revolver in my pocket, and my body inclined forward in readiness to spring. But Holmes's grip fastened upon my wrist with the inexorable pressure of iron. His lips brushed my ear, and in the faintest whisper, he uttered words that froze me in place. "The spider does not rush the fly." There was in his tone such calm certainty, such unshakable mastery, that my impulse of action died at once. I realized that to Holmes, the intruder was but one move in a larger game, and that to reveal ourselves prematurely would be to lose the advantage of knowledge. We stood, therefore, rigid in our concealment, listening to every faint movement within the chamber. The intruder shifted his weight. The faint rustle of fabric, the slight jingle muffled beneath his cloak, told us that he secured the object close to his person. My heart thudded in protest at our enforced inaction, yet Holmes's face, pale and hawk-like in the gloom, betrayed no hint of doubt. "He believes himself unobserved," Holmes murmured, scarcely audible. "Let him think so. Each step he takes unwittingly tightens the snare." The thought steadied me, though it left my nerves strung taut as violin strings. We watched as shadows flickered across the panelled wall, knowing that the drama was far from ended. A moment later the lantern light dimmed, then vanished altogether, extinguished by the intruder's careful hand. Darkness wrapped the chamber once more, save for the faint glimmer that stole beneath the door from the gas jets in the passage. There followed the sound of slow, deliberate steps, retreating from the centre of the room, each creak of the boards seeming magnified by the hush that surrounded it. The latch clicked gently, and the door inched open. Through the narrow gap I caught a fleeting glimpse of the cloaked form, bent slightly forward, the hidden burden pressed close beneath his arm. He paused upon the threshold, head turning sharply, as though listening for the least betraying breath. My own lungs seemed to rebel against silence, and I held them fast until the moment had passed. With a motion of exquisite caution, he closed the door behind him, leaving the chamber dark and empty. His footfalls faded down the corridor, muffled by distance, until only the beating of my own heart remained. Holmes exhaled softly, the tension leaving his frame in a controlled sigh. "You perceive, Watson, the manner of his departure. Such precision is learned in danger. We deal with no ordinary adventurer, but a man who has long walked the edge of peril." I shuddered at the thought, yet there was no mistaking the truth of it.
Even in leaving, the intruder had contrived to leave no more trace than a whisper of secrecy hanging in the stale air of the chamber. With the grey dawn came a semblance of calm, though both Holmes and I bore the marks of a restless vigil. Over our morning meal, the clatter of dishes and the hum of London stirring to life felt strangely discordant after the night's tension. It was then that Mrs. Carstone entered, pale and drawn, her hands twisting a handkerchief in nervous agitation. "Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson," she began, her voice trembling. "I have turned the matter over in my mind, and I can no longer withhold what I know. You must be aware that Mr. Ellery was not a man without enemies. Before his disappearance, whispers reached me that he had been accused of embezzlement in his firm. There was talk of missing funds, of men ruined by his speculations. I never knew the whole, but the rumours were dark enough." She sank into a chair, her eyes confined to a single locked chamber, but reached outward into darker territories of guilt and retribution. It was later that same morning, while Holmes sat moodily by the window with his long fingers drumming upon the sill, that the black cat intruded once more upon our thoughts. The creature had followed us from the stair, and now it leapt softly to the hearthrug, its emerald eyes fixed upon Holmes as though in mute appeal. For a while my companion regarded it in silence, until a faint smile, touched with irony, played about his lips. "Strange justice, Watson," said he at last. "The most faithful of companions has served as the betrayer. It is this dumb beast, more constant than any human tongue, that has pointed unerringly to the spot where its master concealed his guilt." He bent to stroke the animal, and it purred with an odd, vibrating note, pressing its head against his hand. Yet Holmes's expression remained grave. "Consider, my dear fellow, the irony. A man may employ all his cunning to evade discovery. He may lock doors, silence servants, even feign death itself. But he cannot command the instincts of an animal. Here the loyalty of a pet has proved the undoing of its owner." The thought struck me forcibly, and I could not but recall the strange persistence with which the cat had stationed itself at the threshold of the forbidden room. What to us had been but a curious habit was, to Holmes, evidence of the most damning kind. "Take note, Watson," Holmes continued, "that in this affair, the beast has spoken louder than the woman, the colonel, or the painter. It is not Ellery's voice we have heard, but his cat's." And yet, even as Holmes spoke with such conviction, a disquiet remained in my mind. I could not shake from me the memory of that cloaked figure slipping like a shadow through the chamber, of the furtive hands raising the board, of the faint metallic clink as some hidden prize was withdrawn. Who had that figure been? It was true that all evidence pointed to Ellery, the missing lodger, the accusations of embezzlement, the secret hoard beneath his very floor. And yet the silence of the intruder, the careful precision of his step, left me wondering whether another hand had sought to profit by Ellery's guilt. Had some accomplice, or even an enemy, claimed the treasure as his own? These questions gnawed at me as the hours wore on. Holmes, for his part, seemed content to bide his time, his mind working behind that mask of stillness which concealed more than it revealed. He smoked pipe after pipe, his eyes half closed, as though communing with some inner tribunal. When at last I ventured to give voice to my doubts, he only smiled faintly. "Patience, Watson. The answer will present itself. Whether the phantom of last night was Ellery himself, risen from the Seine, or some rival who covets the spoils of his dishonour, remains to be proved. But mark me well, the truth, however long delayed, leaves always its trace." I could find no reply, and so the chapter closed in uncertainty. Yet the image remained burned upon my mind. A locked door, a faithful cat scratching upon the threshold, and a nameless intruder moving in the darkness, whose identity, Ellery or not, was still veiled in doubt. It was not yet 9 o'clock when the sharp rattle of the knocker resounded through Baker Street, cutting through the comfortable quiet of our breakfast. Mrs. Hudson entered with a blue telegram envelope upon her tray, her expression betraying a curiosity which she instantly sought to suppress. Holmes reached for it with his long, nervous fingers, glanced at the foreign postmark, and handed it without comment into my grasp. "A Paris dispatch, Watson," he remarked, the faintest trace of interest lighting the River Seine. "Drowned some days, personal effects absent. Authorities request confirmation from London." For a moment after the reading there was silence. I confess that a strange chill stole over me as I pictured the body of that errant lodger, drifting lifeless among the refuse of the great French capital, his secrets carried with him into the depths. Holmes remained unmoving, his gaze fixed upon the thin thread of smoke rising from his pipe. Then at length he stirred, his grey eyes brightening with that peculiar mixture of curiosity and irony which marked him when confronted by the unexpected. "So," he said slowly, "Paris provides the curtain fall. Ellery, the man of shadows, ends his drama in the waters of the Seine." Yet even as he spoke, I noted that the faint line between his brows deepened, as if his mind withheld some reservation unspoken. Holmes rose, paced once across the room, and turned to me with a look in which mockery and melancholy were curiously blended. "A man may cross the Channel, Watson," he said, "but his sins have already reserved him a room. The ledger of guilt is not closed by distance. Whether in London or Paris, he who has stolen from his fellows finds that Nemesis has laid aside for him a chamber, furnished with ropes of water and the silence of death." His words, uttered in that dry tone of sardonic reflection, struck me with a peculiar force. I had seen Holmes cold in victory, fierce in pursuit, but seldom had I observed this vein of grim humour, which seemed to turn tragedy into a parable. "You think, then, it is certain that Ellery is dead?" I asked. He shrugged his shoulders lightly. "The river may have taken him, or the tale may have been contrived. Until we place our own eyes upon the evidence, I withhold judgment. But mark the irony, Watson. The man who contrived to vanish so completely is now revealed most utterly as a corpse." Holmes seated himself once more, the telegram upon the table before him, and lapsed into a silence which I knew better than to interrupt. Presently, however, he roused himself, and with that sudden change of manner by which he often relieved tension, he launched into a discourse more scholarly than personal. "You recall, Watson, the hollow note we discovered beneath Ellery's boards? That cavity is no novelty. London is riddled with such subterfuges. In the days of smuggling, it was common for lodgings to possess secret hiding places for contraband. Later, when debtors' prisons threatened ruin, many a desperate soul contrived to conceal his fortune within walls or floors, trusting that poverty above would hide wealth beneath. Indeed, I have seen false chimneys, sliding panels, and cupboards so cunningly contrived that no casual search could reveal them." He leaned forward, his long forefinger extended for emphasis. "Such devices, Watson, are the true confidants of crime. They preserve its treasures and betray its owners. For once a man hides a thing, the hiding place becomes his tyrant. He must return, he must guard, he must betray himself by constant anxiety. Ellery, alive or dead, is no exception. His secret has chained him to that room as surely as if the door were locked from without." I could not forbear a shiver at his words, remembering the kneeling impressions upon the carpet, and the cat's ceaseless vigil at the fatal boards. Holmes sank back, a shadow passing once more across his features.
Whether we confront a corpse in Paris or a living shadow in Bloomsbury, Watson, the hidden chamber beneath those boards is the true heart of the mystery. Holmes's reflections upon the Paris telegram had scarcely concluded when he turned abruptly to me, his voice sharpened with the keen edge of certainty. "You still think, Watson, that beneath those boards we should discover a trove of sovereigns or a bag of stolen gems?" "No, my dear fellow, it is something far more perilous than treasure." His eyes shone with a strange inner light as he paced the room, hands clasped behind him. "Gold is but a bauble, easily hidden, easily spent. Inside such a box lies not lucre, but knowledge, and knowledge in the wrong hands is deadlier than arsenic." The certainty of his words left me with a chill, for I perceived that this affair had already outgrown the bounds of common crime and touched upon shadows larger and darker than I could yet conceive. That same day we returned to the boarding house in Bloomsbury, and I cannot forget the strange oppression which seemed to brood over its halls. Each tenant moved with an air of studied civility, yet behind every greeting lurked something strained, as though each man and woman carried within them a secret too heavy to utter. The young artist passed us on the stair with his hands still smudged in pigment, but his glance darted nervously aside, and the cheerful remark died unspoken upon his lips. The taciturn student remained cloistered in his room, but once I caught the low murmur of foreign speech issuing from behind his door, hushed and anxious in tone. Even the landlady's attempts at hospitality were marked by tremors of voice and the fluttering of her hands. Holmes, with his accustomed composure, moved among them like a physician, diagnosing patients who dare not confess their malady. He observed much and spoke little, content to let the tension reveal itself without forcing words. For my own part, the sense of unspoken knowledge among those lodgers weighed heavily upon me, as though we had stepped not into a home, but into a conspirator's den. It was in the drawing-room, where the rain blurred the panes and the fire sputtered with reluctant warmth, that Holmes leaned toward me. "Mark them well, Watson. We are among men and women who know more than they admit. Their silence is no accident. Something has touched them all, and the touch is of guilt or of fear." That night, the oppressive atmosphere culminated in an event so dreadful that it will forever remain etched upon my memory. It was close upon midnight when a sudden cry rang through the house, a cry so wild and despairing that I leapt from my chair in alarm. Holmes was already at the door, his face set in grim expectation, and together we rushed toward the source. It came from the chamber of the retired colonel. Several lodgers, pale and half-dressed, crowded the landing as we forced our way within. The sight that met our eyes was terrible. The old soldier lay upon his bed, his features distorted in an expression of unspeakable terror. His hands were clenched upon the counterpane, and his eyes, wide open, seemed still fixed upon some vision that had struck him down. I bent quickly to examine him, but my medical knowledge left no doubt. The colonel was dead. Yet there was upon his countenance none of the serenity of natural death. Rather, it was as though fear itself had throttled him. Holmes stood silent at my side, his gaze travelling slowly across the room. He touched nothing, spoke not a word, but I knew that his mind was already weighing every particle of evidence. The murmurs of the frightened tenants behind us swelled into cries of alarm, until the house rang with panic. "Silence!" Holmes commanded at last, his voice low but cutting through the uproar. "This man has taken his last breath. Let us not dishonour him with useless clamour." The scene that followed was one of utter confusion. Women shrieked, men spoke in hurried whispers, and doors opened along the passage as startled tenants thrust out pale faces, eager for news, yet fearful of what they might hear. The air seemed thick with dread, as though the very walls had absorbed the colonel's last unearthly cry. I endeavoured to calm those nearest me, assuring them that death had been instantaneous, though my own heart beat heavily with unease. For what natural cause could so convulse a man's features, freezing terror upon them as his final mask? Holmes remained at the bedside, his tall figure stooped, his fingers resting lightly upon the sheet. His expression wore that peculiar stillness which clings to a room where life has but lately ebbed away. The curtains were half drawn, and the dim light which filtered through gave a ghostly pallor to every object it touched. The bedclothes lay smooth, save for the convulsive clutch of the dead man's hands, and upon the counterpane his body reposed, rigid, yet bearing no outward sign of violence. I bent low, my physician's instinct seeking some clue upon that distorted visage, but found nothing save the mask of horror which death had imprinted there. No wound, no bruise, no mark betrayed the agency that had wrenched the soul from its dwelling. It was as though terror itself had slain him. Holmes stood motionless at the foot of the bed, his keen eyes roving from ceiling to floor with the patient scrutiny of a naturalist observing some rare specimen. He neither spoke nor stirred for several minutes, and the hush grew oppressive, broken only by the hushed whispers of the terrified lodgers beyond the door. At last he moved forward, stooped above the corpse, and drew in his breath sharply, as one who has glimpsed the first glimmer of truth. "Observe, Watson," said Holmes softly, as he bent to examine the colonel's right hand, which was clenched so tightly that the knuckles showed white through the skin. Death has frozen it into this rigidity, but let us see what token he carries with him. With deft fingers, he applied the tip of his penknife to loosen the stiffened grip. Inch by inch the fingers yielded, and at last he drew forth a small shred of fabric, soiled and crumpled, yet instantly recognizable. Holmes held it up to the light, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "The missing glove," he murmured. "You recall, Watson, the solitary one we found upon Ellery's chamber floor? Here lies its mate, or at least a fragment of it, clenched in the hand of the dead man. Death itself accuses." I stared at the scrap with mingled amazement and horror. That the colonel, in his final moments, had grasped this object with such desperation seemed to suggest that he had recognized his assailant, or at the very least the token of his doom. Holmes turned it over delicately between thumb and forefinger. "A glove, Watson, but not merely leather. Mark the faint smear of dye along the edge. Such colouring is not for ornament. It serves as a sign perhaps to those who share in some dark allegiance." The scrap of fabric, insignificant in itself, now loomed as damning evidence. The colonel's rigid clutch had preserved not just a glove, but the very whisper of conspiracy. Holmes bent once more over the lifeless form, his aquiline features sharpened in the dim light. He leaned so near the colonel's lips that his own hair brushed the pillow, then drew back suddenly, his nostrils flaring. "Almonds," he said curtly. "The faintest trace, yet unmistakable. You know what that portends, Watson." I started. Prussic acid? Or a derivative of like nature? Some subtle preparation, swift, noiseless, and deadly. See how the muscles of the face are drawn, the lips retracted, the pupils fixed in terror. Such is the visage of poison, not of apoplexy. Our colonel has not died of natural causes, but by the hand of one who knew well how to use nature's more insidious weapons. The lodgers behind us stirred in renewed alarm, and I confess that a cold perspiration broke upon my brow. That poison had been employed seemed beyond dispute, yet how it had been introduced was another matter. The body showed no wound. There was no overturned glass nor vial, no trace of draught or potion. Holmes straightened, his long fingers steepled before him, and his eyes glimmered with that eerie light which I had come to associate with the dawning of revelation. There is method here, Watson. Cold, deliberate, ingenious method. The glove and the poison are links of one chain, a chain which binds our colonel's fate to Ellery's vanished presence. Holmes paced the chamber slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze thoughtful yet intent. Consider, Watson, how such a poison—
We have cunning, Watson. The cunning of a foe who strikes in silence, leaving no mark but the cold rigidity of fear upon his victim's face. Holmes's gaze darkened as he turned once more to the body. We are no longer tracing a crime of avarice, but a design that speaks of conspiracy and calculated vengeance. The colonel has fallen, but he is not the last. His words chilled me, for I perceived in them a foreshadowing of doom yet to come. It was at that instant, when the stillness of the chamber pressed upon us like a weight, that a low cry arose near the hearth. The black cat had followed us, unseen, and now emerged with noiseless tread. Its green eyes glowed in the dimness, and with an insistence that was almost uncanny, it sprang upon the colonel's great travelling trunk at the foot of the bed. The creature's claws raked at the brass fittings, its tail lashing with agitation, as though it sought by dumb eloquence to draw our attention. Again and again it struck, its paws making a faint rasping sound upon the leather covering. Holmes observed it with narrowed eyes, his head inclined in that bird-like fashion which bespoke the sharpening of his faculties. You note, Watson, how the animal's fidelity extends beyond its master's door. It directs us yet again. We should be foolish to disregard it. I moved to shoo the beast away, but Holmes arrested me with a lifted hand. No, let it guide us. These instincts are rarely misled. Where it scratches, there lies something concealed. Obedient to his command, I fetched the key from the bedside table. With a twist of the lock, the great trunk yielded, creaking open upon its hinges. The cat leapt down at once, seating itself with a curious air of triumph, its gaze fixed expectantly upon the treasure within. Within the trunk lay not the ordinary belongings of a retired officer, but bundles of papers tied with ribbon, their edges worn and their seals broken. Holmes lifted them one by one, his quick eyes darting over the titles and signatures. "These are not the modest affairs of a soldier on pension," he said gravely. "Observe, Watson. Shares in railways across the continent, certificates of investment in obscure enterprises at Antwerp and Trieste, and bonds from firms whose names are unknown to the honest public." The colonel had dipped his hands in waters far from clean. I took one sheaf and attempted to follow its labyrinthine figures, but the sums bewildered me. It appears he was a man of some means. Holmes's smile was thin. Means, yes, but not honour. These investments link him with men who thrive in shadows, men whose fortunes rise and fall with coups, revolutions, and the betrayal of states. Wealth gained thus is but a mask for intrigue. And intrigue, Watson, is a more dangerous companion than poverty. The thought of the colonel, upright and stern in manner, concealing beneath his respectable exterior dealings of such questionable nature, filled me with a sense of disquiet. Holmes, however, betrayed no surprise. He seemed only to confirm a suspicion long held. "The dead man's silence has spoken," he said softly. "His papers speak louder still." Amidst the papers, Holmes's hand closed upon a smaller envelope, yellowed with age and marked by a wax seal already cracked. He opened it carefully and drew forth a single sheet covered with rows of symbols and strange characters, arranged in a pattern more rigid than chance could dictate. I glanced over his shoulder and shook my head in perplexity. A meaningless jumble, Holmes. Figures, slashes, and letters scattered like debris upon a page. Meaningless to you, perhaps,
he replied, his eyes bright with sudden energy. But to one trained in the ways of codes, this is the speech of conspiracy. See here, a simple substitution with double characters for vowels. And here, the repetition of groups which betray a cipher of correspondence, not of commerce. He tapped the sheet with his forefinger, his expression the echoes of an unseen tribunal. Then he turned to me with a gravity that chilled my very blood. "Watson," he said, "this is no mere crime of greed. We stand in the midst of conspiracy." His words struck me with the weight of doom. I recalled the Colonel's distorted features, the glove clenched in death, the scent of poison upon the air. Each element now seemed not isolated, but linked, as threads of one vast and terrible design. Holmes continued, his voice low and deliberate. "The glove is a token, the poison a message, the papers a ledger of guilt, and this cipher the very charter of the society that binds them all. Ellery was no solitary thief. He was but a single player in a drama that reaches beyond these walls. The Colonel, too, was bound within it, and his silence was purchased at the cost of his life." He folded the letter once more, and his eyes gleamed with sombre fire. "Mark my words, Watson. We are no longer tracing the footsteps of a missing lodger, but following the trail of a cabal whose roots sink deep into foreign soil, and whose branches stretch even into London's heart. We have crossed the threshold of common crime into the antechamber of treason." As he spoke, the cat leapt lightly back upon the trunk, its eyes flashing in the dimness. Holmes glanced at it, and a shadow of irony crossed his face. "Even the beast knows, Watson. It scratches not for gold, but for truth. And truth is the most dangerous treasure of all." Holmes had carried the ciphered sheet back with him to Baker Street, and no sooner had we set foot within our rooms than he spread it carefully upon the desk. His long fingers smoothed the paper with the tenderness of a jeweller handling some rare stone, and his eyes gleamed with that peculiar brightness which I had come to recognize as the herald of intellectual battle. "Here, Watson," he said, tapping the page with his forefinger, "lies the true heart of our affair. Not in the corpse of the Colonel, nor in the vanished lodger, but in this humble scrap of paper. These marks are the footprints of thought, as legible to me as the trail of a fox across fresh snow." I drew closer, examining once more the lines of strange characters, the repeated symbols, the baffling arrangement. To me it was but the idle scrawl of a child, or the meaningless jargon of a lunatic. To Holmes it was a worthy adversary, and I could almost feel the keenness of his mind straining against the barrier it presented. He drew up his chair, his features sharpened with intensity. "At last, Watson, a problem that merits the steel of reason. Let us see whether these fellows who deal in poison and in terror have wit enough to cloak their words from me." As he spoke, the fire crackled in the grate, and the fog of London pressed against the panes. The air of our sitting room seemed suddenly charged with the gravity of some secret tribunal, where the fate of nations might hang upon the deciphering of a page. Holmes took up his pen and began briskly, his manner that of a lecturer addressing a single attentive pupil. "You must understand, Watson, that the art of secret writing is as old as human deceit. Every age has bred its own contrivances. The simplest, and therefore the most frequent, is substitution, one letter standing in place of another. You will have read of the Caesar cipher, where each character is advanced by a fixed number. A schoolboy's trick, but one that has served armies in the field. Next comes transposition, by which the letters remain unaltered, but their order is shifted, like soldiers exchanging places in a parade. Such methods may perplex the untrained eye, but to one who knows the rhythm of language, their pattern betrays itself. There are, too, the invisible inks of Renaissance days: milk, lemon juice, even the juice of onion, vanishing when dry, yet revealed under heat. And the acrostics, where the true message lies in the initial or final letters of each line, while the body of the text is but camouflage. He paused, his gaze intent upon the ciphered sheet. Our present correspondent, however, is of a more advanced school. See as lay within my power. He bade me count the number of times certain symbols appeared, and to mark their positions with crosses upon a chart. I obeyed with diligence, though to my mind the labour was both tedious and bewildering. "Note, Watson," Holmes said, glancing at my clumsy array of marks. "This symbol occurs with unusual frequency at the end of groups. That is the natural place for a vowel. And here, two identical marks in succession. What English word could that represent? Perhaps letter, I hazarded, proud of my ingenuity. Or kill, said Holmes dryly, his lips curling in faint amusement. Our friends are not apt to write of innocent things. Despite his correction, I persevered, copying and tallying with all the earnestness of a schoolboy before his master. The characters swam before my eyes, and I confess that, had I been left to myself, the sheet might as well have been written in the hieroglyphs of Egypt. Yet Holmes, seeing my good intent, encouraged me with a nod now and again, though his gaze remained fixed upon the cipher, as though it were a living adversary with whom he strove in silence. At last I dropped the pen with a sigh. "Holmes, I fear my efforts hinder more than they help. I see no sense in it." "On the contrary, Watson," he returned kindly, "your blunders light the path as truly as my deductions. Between us we shall extract the truth, though you may not yet perceive how." It was after an hour of this painstaking labour that a sudden gleam lit Holmes's face. He struck his hand upon the table, his voice vibrant with satisfaction. "The key, Watson! The key has turned at last. Observe this sequence. Repeated thrice in the letter, it corresponds to the word England. See how the pattern fits? From there the rest follows as naturally as dawn after night." With rapid strokes of his pen, he filled in the blanks, letters replacing symbols, words springing into coherence where before had been only confusion. My eyes widened as phrases emerged. The Brotherhood convenes. The list of names. Deliver to the Society. Holmes sat back, his features grave yet exultant. "You perceive, Watson, the nature of our find. This is correspondence not of commerce, but of conspiracy. The Colonel, and Ellery too, were entangled in the meshes of a foreign society, bound by oath and silence, whose power reaches across borders. The glove was their token, the cipher their bond, and poison their weapon of discipline." I shuddered at the revelation, for the thought that such shadowy forces moved unseen about our very city was chilling in the extreme. Yet Holmes regarded it with the composure of a man who had looked into many dark corners of human endeavour and found there nothing to surprise him. "Thus, Watson," he concluded, folding the paper with care, "our task is no longer to discover who pilfered a casket, but to learn how far this Brotherhood's hand extends, and whose name, perchance, is next upon their dreadful list." Holmes laid the ciphered letter aside and took once more into his hands the glove which had been found in Ellery's chamber. He held it delicately, his sharp eyes dwelling upon the faint, irregular stain that marked its surface. "You recall, Watson," said he, "how the Colonel's lifeless hand clutched a shred of this very glove. Its presence is no accident. See here, this blot of dye. Unlike any common colouring matter, it is no mere blemish of carelessness, but an intentional mark. Among secret societies, tokens such as these are the coin of communication. A card, a flower, a ribbon, all may serve. In this instance, a glove, marked by a peculiar tincture known only to the initiated, becomes the silent summons of doom." He leaned back in his chair, turning the glove so that the firelight caught the faint sheen of the stain. To the unknowing,
it is a discarded article of dress. To the chosen circle, it is a warrant of betrayal. Whoever receives such a token stands condemned in their eyes. It is both signal and sentence, handed down without word or written decree. I continued, "Let us be plain, Watson. The Colonel's demise was not the result of failing constitution, nor of accident, nor even of common malice. It was an execution, a cold, deliberate silencing by those who considered him false to their cause. The faint odour of almonds upon his lips betrays the means. Poison, swift and subtle, administered without the chance of resistance. No hand struck him, yet he died as surely as though felled by a bullet." I could not but exclaim, "You mean that he was judged and slain in secret, by men who act outside the law?" "Precisely. The law is their enemy, and justice their mask. They deem themselves sovereign over life and death. To them, loyalty is survival, and doubt is death. The Colonel, whether through hesitation, indiscretion, or perhaps remorse, showed some weakness. The token was sent, the poison followed, and the circle closed about him." I shuddered, picturing the wheezing figure we had encountered only days before, now stiff upon his bed with terror still imprinted upon his face. Holmes's reasoning, relentless though it was, admitted of no alternative explanation. "He has paid the price," Holmes added grimly, "and in his fall has unwittingly revealed the mechanism of the society. One victim is sufficient to teach us their method. But it will not end here, Watson. Others in this house walk with that same shadow upon them, though they may not yet perceive its approach." He replaced the glove upon the desk, its stain glimmering faintly like a brand of shame. The atmosphere of the boarding house in Bloomsbury altered perceptibly in the days that followed. It seemed to me that the very walls had absorbed the dread of the Colonel's passing, and that every creak of stair or sigh of draught was heavy with unspoken suspicion. At breakfast, the lodgers sat stiffly about the table, their eyes darting from one to another, yet seldom meeting. The foreign student muttered in his own tongue, his gaze lowered as though he feared detection of some inner thought. The young artist picked at his bread with absent fingers, his blotched hands trembling ever so slightly. Even Mrs. Carstone, once full of nervous chatter, now moved in subdued silence, her voice reduced to hushed tones, as if the house itself forbade loud speech. Holmes observed all with his customary detachment, though I perceived the intensity of his attention in the keen flicker of his glance. "See, Watson," he murmured, "how guilt, whether known or suspected, alters the carriage of every soul. Each man suspects his neighbour. Each fears that the hidden tribunal has marked his name. The society needs no jailers when terror itself is warder enough." It was indeed a curious spectacle, that little household sunk in gloom, each member treading as if upon dangerous ground. A cough was cause for alarm, a whisper for dread, and the black cat, ever prowling in the hall, seemed to them less a pet than a spectral messenger of fate. I confess that I felt my own spirits weighed down by the pall of that place. It seemed that the sunlight never entered its windows, and that Bloomsbury itself was cloaked in a gloom thicker than the London fog. It was in the earliest hour of morning, when the mist lay low upon the pavements and the gas lamps burned with wan flickering flame, that Holmes and I, roused by our own restlessness, descended to the street. The boarding house lay hushed behind us, save for the faint stirring of the cat upon the stairs. As we turned the corner, Holmes touched my arm and inclined his head. There, moving stealthily along the opposite pavement, was the figure of the young artist whom we had noted days before. His thin frame was bent beneath the weight of a satchel slung over his shoulder, and his steps, though quick,
bore the peculiar caution of one who fears to be observed. The fog half shrouded his form, but the outline of his stained sleeves was unmistakable. You glanced once behind him, instinct of a hound upon the scent. Once the fellow paused, glancing about him with suspicion, and we, halting in a doorway, held our breath until he moved on. My heart thudded in my chest with the mingled excitement of the chase and the dread of discovery. "He makes for some appointed place," Holmes murmured between strides. "Mark how his course tends eastward. We shall see soon enough what errand compels such haste at dawn." The fog thickened, swallowing the figure ahead until he was but a wraith flitting through the vapour. Yet still we pressed on, our steps echoing softly on the stones, until Holmes raised his hand for silence. The artist had paused again, and in the hush of the early hour the faint rattle of his satchel reached us, as though some metallic weight shifted within. Holmes's eyes flashed in the gloom. "Courage, Watson," he whispered. "The next turn may show us whether we hunt an accomplice, a victim, or the betrayer himself." The fog of that early morning seemed to fold around us like a living shroud, swallowing sound and shadow alike. Through it darted the hurrying figure of the young artist, his shoulders bent forward and his satchel clutched tightly to his side, as though the very weight of it were both his burden and his doom. Holmes and I pressed on, our steps muffled on the damp stones, the white vapour curling about our ankles and rising in ghostly billows. Never had I seen my companion more alive to the thrill of pursuit. His eyes gleamed beneath the brim of his hat, and his long stride carried him with unerring precision through the winding byways. He seemed to read the fugitive's course as plainly as though it had been mapped before him. The artist quickened his pace, his thin figure little more than a wraith moving through the mist. Twice he glanced behind him, and twice I saw the pallor of terror upon his face. Yet he dared not cry out. The silence of guilt pressed upon his lips. "We must cut him off, Watson," Holmes whispered between measured breaths. "He makes for the river." The chase lengthened, and still the fog thickened, turning London into a labyrinth of unseen walls and hidden turns. My heart pounded with the exertion, my breath clouding in the chill air, yet the excitement of the hunt drove me on. The satchel rattled faintly with each desperate stride of its bearer, betraying that within lay something more than idle sketches or brushes. "Steady," murmured Holmes. "The spider tightens the web. Another turn and he shall have nowhere left to fly." It was at a sudden corner that Holmes, with characteristic foresight, swerved aside into a narrow passage running parallel to the artist's path. I followed close upon his heels, scarce understanding his design until, with a final dart, he sprang across the fugitive's course. The young man gave a strangled cry and staggered back. The lane into which he had fled was a cul-de-sac, hemmed in by high, dripping walls and strewn with refuse. The fog hung heavy there, muffling sound and obscuring the dim outlines of shuttered windows above. Flight was impossible. He was caught fast, a moth ensnared in the web. Holmes raised a hand, calm yet commanding. "Enough, sir. Your race is run. You will oblige me by standing where you are." The artist's chest heaved with the violence of his exertion, his eyes wild, his trembling hands still clutching the leather strap of his satchel. He cast about for some avenue of escape, but none presented itself. A long silence followed, broken only by the muffled rumble of a cart in the street beyond. At last, with a low groan, he leaned back against the wall, the satchel slipping from his grasp to the stones at his feet.
In the pale light that filtered through the fog, the lodger's figure seemed pitiably frail. He pressed himself against the damp bricks, his face drawn with exhaustion, and his lips quivering as though each word cost him dear. "I am no murderer," he cried in a hoarse whisper, raising his hands as if to ward off some unseen accuser. "By heaven, I never laid finger upon the colonel. I feared him, but I never harmed him." Holmes regarded him with held judgment. At last, with shaking fingers, the man stooped and lifted the satchel. "You shall see," he murmured. "You shall know that I speak truth." He placed the satchel upon a broken crate and fumbled at its clasp with fingers so unsteady that I half expected him to drop it once more. At length, the worn leather gave way, and he drew forth a bundle of folded papers, some torn, others yellowed with damp. Slips of ciphered writing tumbled to the ground, marked with the same curious symbols we had seen before. "These," he said, his voice faltering, "I concealed beneath the floorboards of Ellery's chamber. Each week I was summoned to place another, to lift a board, to hide what was entrusted to me. I asked no questions. I dared not. They threatened me, threatened my very life. What was I, a poor painter with debts, against such men?" Holmes bent over the scattered sheets, his face unreadable in the dim light. He turned one over, his eye alighting on the intricate symbols. "Cipher, Watson," he murmured. "Another link in the chain." Then, raising his gaze to the trembling figure, "And you, sir, were the hand that concealed them, though not the brain that devised them." The artist bowed his head in abject misery. "I swear I am innocent of blood. I wished only to be left in peace. But the shadow fell upon me. Believe me, I feared the colonel as much as I now fear you." Holmes's eyes narrowed, yet still he withheld judgment. His silence was like a weight pressing upon us all, and I felt that the fog about us grew darker with every passing second. "Enough," he said at last, straightening. "We have the papers. But whether you are accomplice or victim, that, Watson, remains for us to discover." The artist's voice shook, as though each syllable were wrenched from his very soul. His narrow shoulders quivered, and his eyes, wide with fear, darted about the mist-choked alley, as if he expected vengeance to descend upon him from the very shadows. "I was but a pawn," he stammered. "They chose me for my weakness, for my debts, and for my solitude. A painter has no fortune, no friends of influence, no strength with which to resist. They told me that if I did not obey, I should vanish as others had vanished, nameless, unmarked, forgotten." He wrung his hands with pitiable earnestness. "Their messages came by strangers, sometimes by letter thrust beneath my door, sometimes by whisper from a man whose face I never saw twice. I was to conceal the packets, never to read them, never to question. What could I do? To refuse was to die, and to comply was to live under a curse." Holmes, who had stood motionless while these confessions poured forth, inclined his head ever so slightly, his eyes alight with a cold and measuring gleam. I could see that every tremor, every falter in the man's tone was weighed in that relentless balance. The artist pressed on, his voice breaking. "I swear to you, I never sought gain from it. I gained nothing but fear. They made me servant to a cause I did not understand, a shadow of men more ruthless than I can name." The words trailed off into a choking sob, leaving silence heavy between the dripping walls of the cul-de-sac. With sudden fervour, he raised his hands, as though to thrust away the very thought. "But mark this well. The colonel's death was not of my doing. I trembled before him, for I knew he was ensnared as surely as I.
Yet never once did I lift a hand against him. I feared to meet his gaze, for I suspected he read my part in their schemes. But I would not, I could not, be his murderer. His chest heaved, and his words came in gasps. When they told me to place the letter with the cipher, I did so, thinking only to save myself from ruin. But the poison that stilled his heart, that was the work of others, of the hidden masters whose faces I never saw. The vehemence of his denial, joined to the pallor that overspread his features, lent him a sincerity which even my cautious judgment could scarcely dispute. He seemed a man hunted rather than hunter, one who shrank from violence rather than dealt it. His terror itself became a witness.
Strength within him. He clasped his face in his hands and murmured incoherently. But I caught one phrase repeated. Spared. If only I am spared. Holmes regarded him with a calm that was more dreadful than anger. His silence fell like a sentence unspoken, and I felt the weight of it settle upon us all. Then, with an abruptness that startled me, Holmes turned away, as though the matter were dismissed. "Come, Watson," he said quietly. "We have seen enough." The artist lifted his head in sudden relief, his eyes gleaming with hope where despair had been. He seemed to believe that Holmes's silence was mercy, that his trembling confession had won a reprieve. With shaking hands, he gathered the fallen papers back into the satchel, clutching it to his breast as though life itself lay within. Holmes, however, had not once uttered the words of pardon. He merely permitted the man his illusion, a fragile shield against the storm that even now gathered about him. As we retraced our steps into the waking streets, the fog lifting faintly with the dawn, Holmes leaned toward me with that grave composure which so often masked the fire of his thought. "There is still one who waits," he murmured, his eyes fixed upon some inner vision. Patient as the cat at the door, silent and certain. The day of retribution will not be hastened by our hand, Watson. Yet it comes nonetheless. The words chilled me more than the morning mist, for I knew that in his mind's eye, Holmes already discerned the true architect of the Colonel's fate. And somewhere, in the shadowed corners of London, justice crouched in silence, biding its hour. The evening descended upon Bloomsbury with a heaviness that seemed to settle not only upon the streets, but upon the very souls of those within the boarding-house. From the narrow windows the glow of lamps shone faintly, dulled by curtains drawn in haste, as if to shut out a world that pressed too closely. The house itself appeared steeped in uneasy silence. No laughter echoed from its parlour. No tread of convivial footsteps stirred the stair. One by one the tenants retired early, leaving behind them a hush that was broken only by the creak of boards and the sigh of the wind along the eaves. I confess that my own nerves were attuned to that oppressive stillness. The memory of the Colonel's sudden death lingered like a shadow, and in every rustle of drapery I seemed to hear the whisper of conspiracy. Even the cat, that strange herald of unease, sat unmoving upon the mat, its eyes fixed unwaveringly on the door of Ellery's chamber. Holmes moved with his habitual composure, though I knew him too well not to detect the taut expectancy that animated his every motion. He glanced once toward me, and in the dimness I discerned the gleam of anticipation in his eyes. "Tonight, Watson," he murmured, "the veil shall be lifted. The house itself waits, hushed, for the step that will betray the truth." The words fell with the weight of prophecy, and I felt a cold thrill pass through me as the last light of day yielded to the dominion of night. We took our station in the narrow recess at the head of the stair, where a length of shadow provided us concealment.
There we remained, scarcely daring to stir, as the hours crept by with inexorable slowness. The house, sunk into its nocturnal slumber, gave forth the occasional groan of timbers or distant cough from a restless lodger, but otherwise lay in a silence that seemed alive with secret tension. Holmes, crouched beside me, was as still as a figure carved in stone. Only the faint rise and fall of his breath betrayed the life within him. From time to time he leaned close and whispered some brief observation. A footstep above, the soft fall of ashes in the grate below. Yet these murmurs were delivered. Presently, a figure emerged from the gloom below, cloaked and hooded, his movements slow and deliberate, as one who has traversed that path before and knows the dangers it conceals. The dim moonlight, filtering weakly through a skylight, revealed only fragments: the gleam of a button, the gloved hand that trailed lightly along the banister, the brief flash of steel at his waist. The man paused, listening intently, his head turning with the wary caution of the hunted. Then, satisfied, he crept onward, his steps so carefully measured that even the ancient boards uttered no protest. I felt my heart thud heavily in my chest as he halted before Ellery's door. From within the folds of his cloak he drew a slender instrument, and with practiced ease slipped it into the lock. A faint click followed, and the door swung back upon its hinges with scarcely a sound. Holmes's eyes, sharp as a hawk's in the gloom, never wavered from the man's every motion. His hand brushed mine in silent command to remain still, and I obeyed, though every instinct urged me to spring forth and seize the interloper. The figure glided within the chamber and, closing the door behind him, was swallowed by the deeper shadows of the room. Through the narrow crack of the door, we glimpsed the wavering glow of a lantern, faint and uncertain as it cast its circle upon the barren floor. The intruder moved with an air of grim purpose, his cloak thrown back to reveal the bent shoulders of a man wearied by secrecy, yet driven by necessity. He knelt swiftly, his hands fumbling with a familiarity that spoke of repeated visits. With a deft motion, he pressed upon a loosened board near the threshold, the very spot the cat had so persistently marked. A muffled creak followed, and the plank yielded to his touch, exposing the dark cavity beneath. The silence of the house seemed to deepen as he thrust his arm within. I caught the faint scrape of metal against wood, then the slow withdrawal of a small iron casket. Its dull gleam in the lantern light told of weight and substance. Whatever it contained was of no trifling value. The intruder set it carefully upon the floor, his breath audible in the stillness. Holmes leaned toward me, his lips scarcely moving. "Mark that, Watson. Not gold, something heavier. A man does not risk his liberty for mere coin." The figure rested a trembling hand upon the casket, as though the touch alone confirmed possession of some long-coveted prize. My pulse quickened, and I felt upon the verge of action. Yet Holmes's restraining hand held me in check, the pressure of his fingers warning that the moment was not yet ripe. The intruder bent lower, his cloak falling forward to shroud his movements. Whatever lay within that iron box was now to be revealed. It was at that instant, when the iron casket lay upon the boards and the intruder's hand hovered above its clasp, that Holmes moved. With a suddenness that startled even me, he sprang from our concealment, his lean figure cutting through the gloom like a blade of steel. His hand shot forth, grasping the man's wrist in a grip of iron, and with a violent wrench dragged him to his feet. The lantern toppled and swung wildly, casting grotesque shadows that leapt and vanished across the bare chamber. A cry escaped the captive,
muffled and hoarse, but Holmes's fingers held him fast. "No more skulking in shadows, sir," said my companion, his voice cold and inexorable. "The game is up, and you shall answer here in the light." The man struggled, his cloak twisting about him, but Holmes bore him inexorably into the centre of the room, where the lamplight revealed his gaunt form in stark relief. With a swift motion, Holmes tore back the hood that had concealed the intruder's face. What met our gaze was no stranger's countenance, but that of Ellery himself, though so altered that for a moment I scarce recognized him. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes sunken deep in their sockets, and the pallor of his restoring the very figures most eager to be rid of justice. Ellery made no reply, save to cast one wild glance toward the casket at his feet. It was clear that whatever remained within was to him of more value than life itself. At Holmes's command, I stooped and drew the iron casket nearer. Its lock yielded quickly under my companion's deft touch, and the lid creaked open upon hinges stiff with long concealment. I confess my expectation was to behold coin, jewels, or some other tangible wealth, the hoard of a desperate fugitive, but the sight that met our eyes was of another order. Within, carefully folded and bound with string, lay a sheaf of papers. The topmost bore a list of names, inscribed in a precise hand, and accompanied by notes and figures whose meaning was dark to me. Holmes scanned the page with an intensity that betrayed its import. "These are not accounts of money," he said at last, his voice low but resolute. "They are accounts of men. Englishmen, Watson. Men who have bartered loyalty for gold and lent themselves to the service of a foreign society." He turned another sheet, his brows knitting. "Here is proof beyond surmise, names beyond denial. This casket holds not treasure, but the very sinews of treachery." Ellery's eyes gleamed with a fevered light as he watched us. "Yes," he whispered, "I kept them safe. Too safe. And now they will undo me." For one fleeting instant, I beheld upon Holmes's face an expression I had seldom seen. Relief, profound and unmistakable. His shoulders eased, and the hard line of his mouth softened as he held the incriminating list in his hand. "Watson," he said quietly, "we have that which no court may refute. No longer whispers, nor suspicions, nor shadows on the wall, but proof, tangible and irrefutable. The net is closed, not by conjecture, but by fact." I marvelled at that moment, for Holmes, who so often pursued truth with an almost merciless detachment, seemed now stirred by something deeper, a recognition that justice, so elusive in this tangled affair, had at last been secured. Yet the light in his eyes faded quickly, replaced by vigilance. For Ellery, though cornered, was not subdued. His gaze darted restlessly, like that of a trapped creature seeking some final avenue of escape. It was then, in that charged silence, that the strangest of interlopers made itself known. With a sudden yowl, the black cat sprang from the shadows of the corridor and darted into the chamber. Its eyes shone like twin emeralds as it leapt upon the floor, striking against the casket with a clatter. The sound was enough. Ellery started violently, his gaunt frame stiffening with panic. His hand flew to his breast, and before Holmes could restrain him, he had drawn forth a small vial, its glass catching the lamplight. With desperate swiftness, he wrenched out the stopper and flung the contents to his lips. "Stop!" I cried, but the deed was done. A ghastly change overspread his features. His eyes rolled back, and his limbs convulsed. The vial slipped from his fingers, shattering upon the boards. He sank heavily to the floor, his face already drawn with the marks of approaching death. Holmes knelt beside him, but one glance sufficed. "The final refuge of the guilty," he murmured. "When cornered by truth, they seek silence in death." The cat, unheeding, sat calmly beside the fallen man, its tail curling about its paws, as though it had waited only for this consummation. I stood transfixed by the irony of it, that the same creature whose fidelity had betrayed its master had also startled him into his fatal act. No sooner had the vial slipped from Ellery's fingers than the poison declared its mastery. His gaunt frame convulsed, every sinew tightening in the violence of its seizure. His hands clawed at the empty air as though to ward off unseen assailants, and a low, guttural moan broke from his lips. The lantern's trembling glow threw grotesque shadows of eyes staring wide yet unseeing, the terrible fire within them quenched forever. A silence followed, a silence broken only by the faint hiss of the dying lantern and the steady drip of water from the roof above. The cat crept forward, its green eyes gleaming, and seated itself beside the lifeless figure as though keeping vigil. It is a cruel fate, and one I have witnessed oftener than I could wish, that guilt may find its end in death. Yet the lips of the dying remain sealed against confession. So it was with Ellery. His lips, pale and cracked, parted more than once, as though some final revelation trembled there. But no word emerged. Only a faint, rattling sigh escaped, the last sound of breath before the silence of eternity claimed him. I confess the moment weighed heavily upon me. For days we had pursued shadows, piecing together fragments of deceit and treachery, and now that the very man who might have cast full light upon the matter lay before us, he departed with his secret intact. It was as though the truth itself had mocked us, lingering at the threshold but refusing entry. Holmes rose slowly, his tall figure outlined against the dim glow. He looked down upon the body with eyes that betrayed no pity, but a certain austere resignation. "There is irony in this, Watson," he said quietly. "We strain to draw from a man's tongue the words that might redeem or condemn. Yet it is often fate, not justice, that dictates silence. He dies with his story untold, but not with his guilt unproven." The stillness of that room oppressed me. The bare walls, the overturned lantern, the black cat seated like some inscrutable sentinel, all combined to leave upon my spirit an impression of solemn finality. And yet, even in that oppressive quiet, I felt that the case had not ended. For the documents upon the floor spoke where Ellery's lips would not. Holmes bent and gathered the scattered contents of the casket with careful precision, his long fingers moving swiftly yet deliberately, as though he handled not mere paper, but the destinies of men. The lists, the ciphered notes, the annotations in Ellery's cramped hand, all were replaced within the iron box, which he then closed with a decisive snap. He straightened, the casket secure beneath his arm, and turned to me with a look in which triumph and gravity were strangely mingled. "Though the man is lost to us, Watson," said he, "his legacy remains, and it is of far greater value than his confession would have been. In these pages lies evidence sufficient to shake more than one proud house in London. The government shall have it, and with it the means to strike at the very root of this malignant society." His words fell with the weight of conviction, yet his tone was marked with no exultation. It was as if the victory tasted bitter upon his lips, the cost of it being measured in a life extinguished before our very eyes. For my own part, I could not but reflect upon the strange chain of events that had led us to this moment. A cat's fidelity, a locked door, a lodger thought drowned, and a casket of names hidden beneath the floorboards of a commonplace boarding house. And now, in the hush of that chamber, the names themselves seemed to whisper of dangers yet to come. Holmes, however, betrayed no uncertainty. He placed his hand firmly upon the casket. "This," he declared, "is decisive. The conspiracy is unmasked, though its voice has fallen silent." Though Holmes spoke with assurance that the names within the casket would suffice to pierce the heart of the conspiracy,
I confess that my own mind remained troubled. For every name written upon those yellowing slips, how many more might be absent? Men unseen, hands unrecorded, lurking still within the shadows of Europe's great capitals. The list, though damning, might be but a fragment, a corner torn from the cloth of a far greater design. I voiced as much to Holmes as we made ready to depart. Yet he merely inclined his head, his lips compressed in that enigmatic manner which later, in the small hours of the morning, I found Holmes seated by the hearth at Baker Street, his long frame sunk into the armchair, his chin resting lightly upon his steepled fingers. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing like watchful eyes in the grate, and the quiet of the room was broken only by the steady tick of the clock upon the mantel. He sat thus in rare stillness, a figure of profound thought, his features softened by fatigue, yet illuminated by that inner fire which no exhaustion could wholly quench. Before him, upon the table, lay the iron casket, now locked once more, its grim secret secure until placed in the hands of authority. For some time he spoke not at all, and I, respecting the sanctity of his meditation, remained silent. At last he stirred, and in a tone less sharp than his wont, he said, "Strange, is it not, Watson, how men, with all their vaunted reason, betray themselves by the simplest of tokens? A glove, a floorboard, the scratching of a loyal beast. These bring to naught the cunning of conspirators. Loyalty, in its dumbest form, outwits treachery in its most refined." There was in his voice neither triumph nor mockery, but rather a sombre recognition of the irony that beasts may prove truer than men. The black cat, in its persistence, had undone that which my friend's keenest reason could only pursue. Holmes leaned forward, and the dying embers cast shadows that accentuated the sternness of his expression. His eyes, fixed upon the casket, seemed to pierce through it into the tangled depths of human deceit it represented. "Consider, Watson," said he, "the nature of justice. Men imagine it swift and loud, heralded by fanfare and judgment. Yet in truth, it waits, patient, implacable, silent. It stands at the door, asking no admission, until the guilty hand itself turns the key." He spoke slowly, almost as though he were weighing each word against the experience of the night. Ellery thought to preserve himself by secrecy, yet it was he who carried the vial. He thought to lock his treasure beneath boards, yet it was his cat that marked the place. He thought to silence suspicion by death abroad, yet it was his very return that betrayed him. Thus, he himself unbolted the door upon which justice waited. The remark struck me with peculiar force, for I could not but see the truth in it. Each act of concealment had drawn Ellery further into the snare, until at last he was compelled by his own hand to reveal both his guilt and his fear. Holmes's tone softened, though his eyes remained grave. "Justice, Watson, is inexorable, but it is also patient. We need not hasten it, for the guilty do so themselves." The case closed upon itself with a singular image, which lingers with me still as the most haunting of all. For when we returned once more to Bloomsbury to apprise the landlady of what had occurred, the house lay silent, its tenants hushed into fearful whispers. Ellery's chamber stood empty, the floorboards replaced, the air heavy with the memory of what had transpired there. And there, at the threshold as ever, sat the black cat. Calm, inscrutable, its green eyes unblinking. It waited with the same quiet insistence that had first summoned us to the mystery. Its posture was not of grief, nor of expectancy,
but of patient repose, as though its vigil were fulfilled. Holmes paused beside it, his keen gaze softening in an unusual manner. "Not for its master does it wait," he murmured, "but for truth itself. Strange, is it not, Watson, that in the end it is the beast that proves the truest sentinel of justice?" I could frame no answer, for the sight held me with peculiar awe. The animal, indifferent to the tremors of human guilt and fear, had sat steadfast at the very door where the guilty hid. Its presence had spoken when men dared not. Thus the tale concluded. Subscribe for more Holmes mysteries and share the story with those who, like us, cannot resist the lure of deduction.